On the Soul by Aristotle, written 350 BC, translated by J.A. Smith, Part 1, Book 1. Holding as we do that, while knowledge of any kind is a thing to be honored and prized, one kind of it may, either by reason of its greater exactness or of a higher dignity and greater wonderfulness in its objects, be more honorable and precious than another. On both accounts we should naturally be led to place in the front rank the study of the soul. The knowledge of the soul admittedly contributes greatly to the advance of truth in general, and above all to our understanding of nature, for the soul is in some sense the principle of animal life. Our aim is to grasp and understand, first, its essential nature, and secondly, its properties. Of these, some are taught to be affections proper to the soul itself, while others are considered to attach to the animal owing to the presence within it of soul. To attain any assured knowledge about the soul is one of the most difficult things in the world, as the form of question which here presents itself, viz., the question, what is it? Recurs in other fields. It might be supposed that there was some single method of inquiry applicable to all objects whose essential nature, as we are endeavoring to ascertain, there is for derived properties the single method of demonstration. In that case, what we should have to seek for would be this unique method. But if there is no such single and general method for solving the question of essence, our task becomes still more difficult. In the case of each different subject, we shall have to determine the appropriate process of investigation. If to this there be a clear answer, that the process is demonstration or division or some known method, difficulties and hesitations still beset us. With what facts shall we begin the inquiry? For the facts which form the starting points in different subjects must be different, as e.g., in the case of numbers and surfaces. First, no doubt it is necessary to determine in which of the summa genera soul lies, what it is. Is it this? Somewhat, a substance, or is it a quale or a quantum, or some other of the remaining kinds of predicates which we have distinguished? Further, does soul belong to the class of potential existence, or is it not rather an actuality? Our answer to this question is of the greatest importance. We must be careful not to ignore the question whether soul can be defined in a single unambiguous formula, as is the case with animal, or whether we must not give a separate formula for each of it, as we do for horse, dog, man, God, in the latter case the universal animal, and so too every other common predicate being treated either as nothing at all or as a later product. Further, if what exists is not a plurality of souls, but a plurality of souls, but a plurality of parts of one soul, which ought we to investigate first, the whole soul or its parts? It is also a difficult problem to decide which of these parts are in nature distinct from one another. Again, which ought we to investigate first, these parts or their functions, mind or thinking, the faculty or the act of sensation, and so on? If the investigation of the functions precedes that of the parts, the further question suggests itself. Ought we not before either to consider the correlative objects, i.e., of sense or thought? It seems not only useful for the discovery of the causes of the derived properties of substances to be acquainted with the essential nature of those substances, as in mathematics it is useful for the understanding of the property of the interior angles of a triangle to right angles to know the essential nature of the straight and the curved, or of the line and the plane, but also conversely, for the knowledge of the essential nature of a substance is largely promoted by an acquaintance with its properties. For, when we are able to give an account conformable to experience of all or most of the properties of a substance, we shall be in the most favorable position to say something worth saying about the essential nature of that subject. In all demonstration, a definition of the essence is required as a starting point, so that definitions which do not enable us to discover the derived properties, or which fail to facilitate even a conjecture about them, must obviously, one and all, be dialectical and futile. A further problem presented by the affections of soul is this: are they all affections of the complex of body and soul, or is there any one among them peculiar to the soul by itself? To determine this is indispensable but difficult. If we consider the majority of them, there seems to be no case in which the soul can act or be acted upon without involving the body. A. G. Anger, courage, appetite, and sensation generally. Thinking seems the most probable exception. But if this too proves to be a form of imagination, or to be impossible without imagination, it too requires a body as a condition of its existence. If there is any way of acting or being acted upon proper to soul, soul will be capable of separate existence. If there is none, its separate existence is impossible. In the latter case, it will be like what is straight, which has many properties arising from the straightness in it. Yet, that of touching a bronze sphere at a point, though straightness divorced from the other constituents of the straight thing cannot touch it in this way. It cannot be so divorced at all, since it is always found in a body. It therefore seems that all the affections of soul involve a body, passion, gentleness, fear, pity, courage, joy, loving, and hating. In all these there is a concurrent affection of the body. In support of this we may point to the fact that, while sometimes on the occasion of violent and striking occurrences there is no excitement or fear felt, on others faint and feeble stimulations produce these emotions, viz., when the body is already in a state of tension resembling its condition when we are angry. Here is a still clearer case. In the absence of any external cause of terror, we find ourselves experiencing the feelings of a man in terror. From all this, it is obvious that the affections of soul are enmattered, formulable essences. Consequently, their definitions ought to correspond, e.g., anger should be defined as a certain mode of movement of such and such a body, or part or faculty of a body, by this or that cause and for this or that end. That is precisely why the study of the soul must fall within the science of nature, at least so far as in its affections it manifests this double character. Hence a physicist would define an affection of soul differently from a dialectician. The latter would define anger as the appetite for returning pain for pain, or something like that, while the former would define it as a boiling of the blood or warm substance around the heart. The latter assigns the material conditions, the former the form or formulable essence. For what he states is the formulable essence of the fact, though for its actual existence there must be embodiment of it in a material such as is described by the other. Thus, the essence of a house is assigned in such a formula as a shelter against destruction by wind, rain, and heat. The physicist would describe it as stones, bricks, and timbers. But there is a third possible description which would say that it was that form in that material with that purpose. Or end, which then among these is entitled to be regarded as the genuine physicist. The one who confines himself to the material, or the one who restricts himself to the formulable essence alone? Is it not rather the one who combines both in a single formula? If this is so, how are we to characterize the other two? Must we not say that there is no type of thinker who concerns himself with those qualities or attributes of the material, which are in fact inseparable from the material, and without attempting even in thought to separate them? The physicist is he who concerns himself with all the properties active and passive of bodies or materials thus or thus defined. Attributes not considered as being of this character he leaves to others, in certain cases it may be to a specialist, e.a. a carpenter or a physician, in others, a. where they are inseparable in fact, but are separable from any particular kind of body by an effort of abstraction, to the mathematician, b. where they are separate both in fact and in thought from body altogether, to the first philosopher or metaphysician. But we must return from this digression, and repeat that the affections of soul are inseparable from the material substratum of animal life, to which we have seen that such affections, passion and fear, attach, and have not the same mode of being as a line or a plane. Tart. 2. For our study of soul it is necessary, while formulating the problems of which in our further advance we are to find the solutions, to call into counsel the views of those of our predecessors who have declared any opinion on this subject, in order that we may profit by whatever is sound in their suggestions and avoid their errors. The starting point of our inquiry is an exposition of those characteristics which have chiefly been held to belong to soul in its very nature. Two characteristic marks have, above all others, been recognized as distinguishing that which has soul in it from that which has soul in it from that which has not, movement and sensation. It may be said that these two are what our predecessors have fixed upon as characteristic of soul. Some say that what originates movement is both preeminently and primarily soul. Believing that what is not itself moved cannot originate movement in another, they arrived at the view that soul belongs to the class of things in movement. This is what led Democritus to say that soul is a sort of fire or hot substance. His forms or atoms are infinite in number. Those which are spherical he calls fire and soul, and compares them to the motes in the air which we see in shafts of light coming through windows. The mixture of seeds of all sorts he calls the elements of the whole of nature. Lysippus gives a similar account. The spherical atoms are identified with soul because atoms of that shape are most adapted to permeate everywhere and to set all the others moving by being themselves in movement. This implies the view that soul is identical with what produces movement in animals. That is why, further, they regard respiration as the characteristic mark of life. As the environment compresses the bodies of animals and tends to extrude those atoms which impart movement to them, because they themselves are never at rest, there must be a reinforcement of these by similar atoms coming in from without in the act of respiration, for they prevent the extrusion of those which are already within by counteracting the compressing and consolidating force of the environment, and animals continue to live only so long as they are able to maintain this resistance. The doctrine of the Pythagoreans seems to rest upon the same ideas. Some of them declared the motes in air, others what moved them, to be soul. These motes were referred to because they are seen always in movement, even in a complete calm. The same tendency is shown by those who define soul as that which moves itself. All seem to hold the view that movement is what is closest to the nature of soul, and that while all else is moved by soul, it alone moves itself. This belief arises from their never seeing anything originating movement which is not first itself moved. Similarly, also, Anaxagoras, and whoever agrees with him in saying that mind set the whole in movement, declares the moving cause of things to be soul. His position must, however, be distinguished from that of Democritus. Democritus roundly identifies soul and mind, for he identifies what appears with what is true. That is why he commends Homer for the phrase Hector lay with thought distraught. He does not employ mind as a special faculty dealing with truth, but identifies soul and mind. What Anaxagoras says about them is more obscure. In many places he tells us that the cause of beauty and order is mind, elsewhere that it is soul. It is found, he says, in all animals, great and small, high and low, but mind, in the sense of intelligence, appears not to belong alike to all animals, and indeed not even to all human beings. All those, then, who had special regard to the fact that what has soul in it is moved, adopted the view that soul is to be identified with what is eminently originative of movement. All, on the other hand, who look to the fact that what has soul in it knows or perceives what is, identify soul with the principle or principles of nature, according as they admit several such principles or one only. Thus Empedocles declares that it is formed out of all his elements, each of them also being soul. His words are, "For 'tis by earth, we see earth, by water, water, by ether, ether divine, by fire, destructive fire, by love, love, and hate, by cruel hate." In the same way, Plato in the Timaeus fashions soul out of his elements. For like he holds is known by like, and things are formed out of the principles or elements, so that soul must be so too. Similarly, also in his lectures on philosophy, it was set forth that the animal, itself is compounded of the idea itself of the one together with the primary length, breadth, and depth, everything else, the objects of its perception, being similarly constituted. Again, he puts his view in yet other terms. Mind is the monad, science or knowledge the dyad, because it goes undeviatingly from one point to another. Opinion, the number of the plane. Sensation, the number of the plane. Sensation, the number of the solid. The numbers are by him expressly identified with the forms themselves, or principles, and are formed out of the elements. Now things are apprehended either by mind or science or opinion or sensation, and these same numbers are the forms of things. Some thinkers, accepting both premises, viz., that the soul is both originative of movement and cognitive, have compounded it of both, and declared the soul to be a self-moving number. As to the nature and number of the first principles, opinions differ. The difference is greatest between those who regard them as corporeal and those who regard them as incorporeal, and from both dissent those who make a blend and draw their principles from both sources. The number of principles is also in dispute. Some admit one only, others assert several. There is a consequent diversity in their several accounts of soul. They assume, naturally enough, that what is in its own nature originative of movement must be among what is primordial. That has led some to regard it as fire. For fire is the subtlest of the elements and nearest to incorporeality. Further, in the most primary sense, fire both is moved and originates movement in all the others. Democritus has expressed himself more ingeniously than the rest on the grounds for ascribing each of these two characters to soul. Soul and mind are, he says, one and the same thing, and this thing must be one of the primary and indivisible bodies, and its power of originating movement must be due to its fineness of grain and the shape of its atoms. He says that of all the shapes, the spherical is the most mobile, and that this is the shape of the particles of fire and mind. Anaxagoras, as we said above, seems to distinguish between soul and mind, but in practice he treats them as a single substance, except that it is mind that he specially posits as the principle of all things. At any rate, what he says is that mind alone of all that is simple, unmixed and pure. He assigns both characteristics, knowing and origination of movement, to the same principle, when he says that it was mind that set the whole in movement. Fails, too, to judge from what is recorded about him, seems to have held soul to be a motive force, since he said that the magnet has a soul in it because it moves the iron. Diogenes, and others, held the soul to be air because he believed air to be finest in grain and a first principle. Therein lay the grounds of the soul's powers of knowing and originating movement. As the primordial principle from which all other things are derived, it is cognitive. As finest in grain, it has the power to originate movement. Heraclitus, too, says that the first principle, the warm exhalation of which, according to him, everything else is composed, is soul. Further, that this exhalation is most incorporeal and in ceaseless flux, that what is in movement requires that what knows it should be in movement has its being essentially in movement, herein agreeing with the majority. Alcmaeon also seems to have held a similar view about soul. He says that it is immortal because it resembles the immortals, and that this immortality belongs to it in virtue of its ceaseless movement. For all the things divine, moon, sun, the planets, and the whole heavens, are in perpetual movement. Of more superficial writers, some, e.g., Hippo, have pronounced it to be water. They seem to have argued from the fact that the seed of all animals is fluid, for Hippo tries to refute those who say that the soul is blood, on the ground that the seed which is the primordial soul is not blood. Another group, Critias, for example, did hold it to be blood. They take perception to be the most characteristic attribute of soul, and hold that perceptiveness is due to the nature of blood. Each of the elements has thus found its partisan except earth. Earth has found no supporter unless we count as such those who have declared soul to be, or to be compounded of, all the elements. All, then, it may be said, characterize the soul by three marks: movement, sensation, incorporeality, and each of these is traced back to the first principles. That is why, with one exception, all those who define the soul by its power of knowing make it either an element or constructed out of the elements. The language they all use is similar, like they say, is known by like. As the soul knows everything, they construct it out of all the principles. Hence, all those who admit but one cause or element make the soul also one, e.g. fire or air, while those who admit a multiplicity of principles make the soul also multiple. The exception is Anaxagoras. He alone says that mind is impassible and has nothing in common with anything else. But if this is so, how or in virtue of what cause can it know? That Anaxagoras has not explained, nor can any answer be inferred from his words. All who acknowledge pairs of opposites among their principles construct the soul also out of these contraries, while those who admit as principles only one contrary of each pair, e.g., either hot or cold, likewise make the soul some one of these. That is why, also, they allow themselves to be guided by the names. Those who identify soul with the hot argue that sen, to live, is derived from sein, to boil, while those who identify it with the cold say that soul, suche, is so called from the process of respiration, and capsaxes. Such are the traditional opinions concerning soul, together with the grounds on which they are maintained. Part 3. We must begin our examination with movement. For doubtless not only is it false that the essence of soul is correctly described by those who say that it is what moves, or is capable of moving itself, but it is an impossibility that movement should be even an attribute of it. We have already pointed out that there is no necessity that what originates movement should itself be moved. There are two senses in which anything may be moved: either directly owing to something other than itself, or B, directly owing to itself, or B, directly owing to itself. Things are indirectly moved, which are moved as being contained in something which is moved. A.g., sailors in a ship, for they are moved in a different sense from that in which the ship is moved. The ship is directly moved. The ship is directly moved, they are in a moving vessel. This is clear if we consider their limbs. The movement proper to the legs, and so to man, is walking, and in this case the sailors are not walking. Recognizing the double sense of being moved, what we have to consider now is whether the soul is directly moved and participates in such direct movement. There are 4 species of movement: locomotion, alteration, diminution, growth. Consequently, if the soul is moved, it must be moved with one or several or all of these species of movement. Now, if its movement is not incidental, there must be a movement natural to it, and if so, as all the species enumerated involve place, place must be natural to it. But if the essence of soul be to move itself, its being moved cannot be incidental to, as it is to what is white or 3 cubits long. They too can be moved, but only incidentally. What is moved is that of which white and 3 cubits long are the attributes, the body in which they inhere. Hence, they have no place, but if the soul naturally partakes in movement, it follows that it must have a place. Further, if there be a movement natural to the soul, there must be a counter-movement unnatural to it, and conversely. The same applies to rest as well as to movement. For the terminus ad quem of a thing's natural movement is the place of its natural rest, and similarly the terminus ad quem of its enforced movement is the place of its enforced rest. But what meaning can be attached to enforced movements or rests of the soul? It is difficult even to imagine. Further, if the natural movement of the soul be upward, the soul must be fire. If downward, it must be earth, for upward and downward movements are the definitory characteristics of these bodies. The same reasoning applies to the intermediate movements, termini, and bodies. Further, since the soul is observed to originate movement in the body, it is reasonable to suppose that it transmits to the body the movements by which it itself is moved, and so, reversing the order, we may infer from the movements of the body back to similar movements of the soul. Now the body is moved from place to place with movements of locomotion. Hence, it would follow that the soul, too, must, in accordance with the body, change either its place as a whole or the relative places of its parts. This carries with it the possibility that the soul might even quit its body and re-enter it, and with this would be involved the possibility of a resurrection of animals from the dead. But it may be contended the soul can be moved indirectly by something else, for an animal can be pushed out of its course. Yes, but that to whose essence belongs the power of being moved by itself cannot be moved by something else except incidentally, just as what is good by or in itself cannot owe its goodness to something external to it or to some end to which it is a means. If the soul is moved, the most probable view is that what moves it is sensible things. We must note also that if the soul moves itself, it must be the mover itself that is moved, so that it follows that if movement is in every case a displacement of that which is in movement, in that respect in which it is said to be moved, the movement of the soul must be a departure from its essential nature, at least if its self-movement is essential to it, not incidental. Some go so far as to hold that the movements which the soul imparts to the body in which it is are the same in kind as those with which it itself is moved. An example of this is Democritus, who uses language like that of the comic dramatist Philippus, who accounts for the movements that Daedalus imparted to his wooden Aphrodite by saying that he poured quicksilver into it. Similarly, Democritus says that the spherical atoms which, according to him, constitute soul, owing to their own ceaseless movements, draw the whole body after them and so produce its movements. We must urge the question whether it is these very same atoms which produce rest also how they could do so. It is difficult and even impossible to say. And in general, we may object that it is not in this way that the soul appears to originate movement in animals. It is through intention or process of thinking. It is in the same fashion that the Timaeus also tries to give a physical account of how the soul moves its body. The soul, it is there said, is in movement, and so, owing to their mutual implication, moves the body also. After compounding the soul substance out of the elements and dividing it in accordance with the harmonic numbers, in order that it may possess a connate sensibility for harmony, and that the whole may move in movements well attuned, the demiurge bent the straight line into a circle. This single circle he divided into two circles united at two common points. One of these he subdivided into 7 circles. All this implies that the movements of the soul are identified with the local movements of the heavens. Now, in the first place, it is a mistake to say that the soul is a spatial magnitude. It is evident that Plato means the soul of the whole to be like the sort of soul which is called mind, not like the sort of soul which is called mind, not like the sensitive or the desiderative soul, for the movements of neither of these are circular. Now, mind is one and continuous in the sense in which the process of thinking is so, and thinking is identical with the thoughts which are its parts. These have a serial unity like that of number, not a unity like that of a spatial magnitude. Hence, mind cannot have that kind of unity either. Mind is either without parts or is continuous in some other way than that which characterizes a spatial magnitude. How, indeed, if it were a spatial magnitude, could mind possibly think? Will it think with anyone indifferently of its parts? In this case, the part must be understood either in the sense of spatial magnitude or in the sense of a point, if a point can be called a part of a spatial magnitude. If we accept the latter alternative, the points being infinite in number, obviously the mind can never exhaustively traverse them. If the former, the mind must think the same thing over and over again, indeed an infinite number of times. whereas it is manifestly possible to think a thing once. Only, if contact of any part whatsoever of itself with the object is all that is required, why need mind move in a circle or indeed possess magnitude at all? On the other hand, if contact with the whole circle is necessary, what meaning can be given to the contact of the parts? Further, how could what has no parts think what has parts, or what has parts think what has none? We must identify the circle referred to with mind, for it is mind whose movement is thinking, and it is the circle whose movement is revolution, so that if thinking is a movement of revolution, the circle which has this characteristic movement must be mind. If the circular movement is eternal, there must be something which mind is always thinking. What can this be? For all practical processes of thinking have limits. They all go on for the sake of something outside the process, and all theoretical processes come to a close in the same way as the phrases in speech which express processes and results of thinking. Every such linguistic phrase is either definitory or demonstrative. Demonstration has both a starting point and may be said to end in a conclusion or inferred result. Even if the process never reaches final completion, at any rate it never returns upon itself again to its starting point. It goes on assuming a fresh middle term or a fresh extreme, and moves straight forward, but circular movement returns to its starting point. Definitions, too, are closed groups of terms. Further, if the same revolution is repeated, mind must repeatedly think the same object. Further, thinking has more resemblance to a coming to rest or a rest than to a movement. The same may be said of inferring. It might also be urged that what is difficult and enforced is incompatible with blessedness. If the movement of the soul is not of its essence, movement of the soul must be contrary to its nature. It must also be painful for the soul to be inextricably bound up with the body. Nay more, if, as is frequently said and widely accepted, it is better for mind not to be embodied, the union must be for it undesirable. Further, the cause of the revolution of the heavens is left obscure. It is not the essence of soul which is the cause of this circular movement. That movement is only incidental to soul. Nor is a fortiori the body its cause. Again, it is not even asserted that it is better that soul should be so moved. And yet the reason for which God caused the soul to move in a circle can only have been that movement was better for it than rest, and movement of this kind better than any other. But since this sort of consideration is more appropriate to another field of speculation, let us dismiss it for the present. The view we have just been examining in company with most theories about the soul involves the following absurdity. They all join the soul to a body, or place it in a body, without adding any specification of the reason of their union, or of the bodily conditions required for it. Yet such explanation can scarcely be omitted, for some community of nature is presupposed by the fact that the one acts and the other is acted upon, the one moves and the other is moved. Interaction always implies a special nature in the two interagents. All, however, that these thinkers do is to describe the specific characteristics of the soul. They do not try to determine anything about the body which is to contain it, as if it were possible, as in the Pythagorean myths, that any soul could be clothed upon with any body. An absurd view, for each body seems to have a form and shape of its own. It is as absurd as to say that the art of carpentry could embody itself in flutes. Each art must use its tools, each soul its body. Part 4. There is yet another theory about soul which has commended itself to many as no less probable than any of those we have hitherto mentioned, and has rendered public account of itself in the court of popular discussion. Its supporters say that the soul is a kind of harmony, for harmony is a blend or composition of contraries, and body is compounded out of contraries. Harmony, however, is a certain proportion or composition of the constituents blended, and soul can be neither the one nor the other of these. Further, The power of originating movement cannot belong to a harmony, while almost all concur in regarding this as a principal attribute of soul. It is more appropriate to call health, or generally one of the good states of the body, a harmony, than to predicate it of the soul. The absurdity becomes most apparent when we try to attribute the active and passive affections of the soul to a harmony. The necessary readjustment of their conceptions is difficult. Further, in using the word harmony, we have one or other of two cases in our mind. The most proper sense is in relation to spatial magnitudes which have motion and position, where harmony means the disposition and cohesion of their parts in such a manner as to prevent the introduction into the whole of anything homogeneous with it, and the secondary sense derived from the former is that in which it means the ratio between the constituents so blended. In neither of these senses is it plausible to predicate it of soul. That soul is a harmony in the sense of the mode of composition of the parts of the body is a view easily refutable. For there are many composite parts, and those variously compounded. Of what bodily part is mind, or the sensitive or the appetitive faculty, the mode of composition? And what is the mode of composition which constitutes each of them? It is equally absurd to identify the soul with the ratio of the mixture. For the mixture which makes flesh has a different ratio between the elements from that which makes bone. The consequence of this view will therefore be that distributed throughout the whole body there will be many souls, since every one of the bodily parts is a different mixture of the elements, and the ratio of mixture is in each case a harmony, a soul. From Empedocles, at any rate, we might demand an answer to the following question, for he says that each of the parts of the body is what it is in virtue of a ratio between the elements. Is the soul identical with this ratio, or is it not rather something over and above this which is formed in the parts? Is love the cause of any and every mixture, or only of those that are in the right ratio? Is love this ratio itself, or is love something over and above this? Such are the problems raised by this account. But, on the other hand, if the soul is different from the mixture, why does it disappear at one and the same moment with that relation between the elements which constitutes flesh or the other parts of the animal body? Further, if the soul is not identical with the ratio of mixture, and it is consequently not the case that each of the parts has a soul, what is that which perishes when the soul quits the body? That the soul cannot either be a harmony or be moved in a circle is clear from what we have said. Yet that it can be moved incidentally is, as we said above, possible, and even that, in a sense, it can move itself, in the sense that the vehicle in which it is can be moved and moved by it. In no other sense can the soul be moved in space. More legitimate doubts might remain as to its movement in view of the following facts. We speak of the soul as being pained or pleased, being bold or fearful, being angry, perceiving, thinking. All these are regarded as modes of movement, and hence it might be inferred that the soul is moved. This, however, does not necessarily follow. We may admit to the full that being pained or pleased or thinking are movements, each of them a being moved, and that the movement is originated by the soul. For example, we may regard anger or fear as such and such movements of the heart, and thinking as such and such another movement of that organ, or of some other. These modifications may arise either from changes of place in certain parts or from qualitative alterations, the special nature of the parts and the special modes of their changes being for our present purpose irrelevant. Yet to say that it is the soul which is angry is as inexact as it would be to say that it is the soul that weaves webs or builds houses. It is doubtless better to avoid saying that the soul pities or learns or thinks, and rather to say that it is the man who does this with his soul. What we mean is not that the movement is in the soul, but that sometimes it terminates in the soul, and sometimes it terminates in the soul, and sometimes starts from it. Sensation, coming from without inwards, and reminiscence starting from the soul and terminating with the movements, actual or residual, in the sense organs. The case of mind is different. It seems to be an independent substance implanted within the soul and to be incapable of being destroyed. If it could be destroyed at all, it would be under the blunting influence of old age. What really happens in respect of mind in old age is, however, exactly parallel to what happens in the case of the sense organs. If the old man could recover the proper kind of eye, he would see just as well as the young man. The incapacity of old age is due to an affection not of the soul, but of its vehicle, as occurs in drunkenness or disease. Thus it is that in old age the activity of mind or intellectual apprehension declines only through the decay of some other inward part. Mind itself is impassible. Thinking, loving, and hating are affections not mind, but of that which has mind so far as it has it. That is why, when this vehicle decays, memory and love cease. They were activities not of mind, but of the composite which has perished. Mind is, no doubt, something more divine and impassible. But the soul cannot be moved is therefore clear from what we have said, and if it cannot be moved at all, manifestly it cannot be moved by itself. Of all the opinions we have enumerated, by far the most unreasonable is that which declares the soul to be a self-moving number. It involves, in the first place, all the impossibilities which follow from regarding the soul as moved, and in the second, special absurdities which follow from calling it a number. How are we to imagine a unit being moved? By what agency? What sort of movement can be attributed to what is without parts or internal differences? If the unit is both originative of movement and itself capable of being moved, it must contain difference. Further, since they say a moving line generates a surface and a moving point a line, the movements of the psychic units must be lines. For a point is a unit having position, and the number of the soul is, of course, somewhere and has position. Again, if from a number or a unit is subtracted, the remainder is another number. But plants and many animals, when divided, continue to live, and each segment is thought to retain the same kind of soul. It must be all the same whether we speak of units or corpuscles. For if the spherical atoms of Democritus became points, nothing being retained but there being a quantum, there must remain in each a moving and moved part, just as there is in what is continuous. What happens has nothing to do with the size of the atoms. It depends solely upon there being a quantum. That is why there must be something to originate movement in the units. If in the animal what originates movement is the soul, so also must it be in the case of the number, so that not the mover and the moved together, but the mover only will be the soul. But how is it possible for one of the units to fulfill this function of originating movement? There must be some difference between such a unit and all the other units, and what difference can there be between one placed unit and another except a difference of position? If then, on the other hand, these psychic units within the body are different from the points of the body, there will be two sets of units both occupying the same place, for each unit will occupy a point. And yet, if there can be two, why cannot there be an infinite number? For if things can occupy an indivisible place, they must themselves be indivisible. If, on the other hand, the points of the body are identical with the units whose number is the soul, or if the number of the points in the body is the soul, why have not all bodies souls? For all bodies contain points or an infinity of points. Further, how is it possible for these points to be isolated or separated from their bodies, seeing that lines cannot be resolved into points? Part 5. The result is, as we have said, that this view, while on the one side identical with that of those who maintain that soul is a subtle kind of body, is on the other entangled in the absurdity peculiar to Democritus' way of describing the manner in which movement is originated by soul. For if the soul is present throughout the whole percipient body, there must, if the soul be a kind of body, be two bodies in the same place, and for those who call it a number, there must be many points at one point, or everybody must have a soul, unless the soul be a different sort of number, other, that is, than the sum of the points existing in a body. Another consequence that follows is that the animal must be moved by its number precisely in the way that Democritus explained its being moved by his spherical psychic atoms. What difference does it make whether we speak of small spheres or of large units, or quite simply of units in movement? One way or another, the movements of the animal must be due to their movements. Hence, those who combine movement and number in the same subject lay themselves open to these and many other similar absurdities. It is impossible not only that these characters should give the definition of soul, it is impossible that they should even be attributes of it. The point is clear if the attempt be made to start from this as the account of soul and explain from it the affections and actions of the soul. A. Reasoning, sensation, pleasure, pain. For, to repeat what we have said earlier, movement and number do not facilitate even conjecture about the derivative properties of soul. Such are the three ways in which soul has traditionally been defined. One group of thinkers declared it to be that which is most originative of movement because it moves itself. Another group to be the subtlest and most nearly incorporeal of all kinds of body. We have now sufficiently set forth the difficulties and inconsistencies to which these theories are exposed. It remains now to examine the doctrine that soul is composed of the elements. The reason assigned for this doctrine is that thus the soul may perceive or come to know everything that is, but the theory necessarily involves itself in many impossibilities. Its upholders assume that like is known only by like, and imagine that by declaring the soul to be composed of the elements, they succeed in identifying the soul with all the things it is capable of apprehending. But the elements are not the only things it knows. There are many others, or, more exactly, an infinite number of others, formed out of the elements. Let us admit that the soul knows or perceives the elements out of which each of these composites is made up. But by what means will it know or perceive the composite whole? A. What God, man, flesh, bone, or any other compound is? For each is, not merely the elements of which it is composed, but those elements combined in a determinate mode or ratio, as Empedocles himself says of bone, the kindly earth in its broad-bosomed molds, 1 of clear water, 2 parts out of 8, and 4 of fire, and so white bones were formed. Nothing, therefore, will be gained by the presence of the elements in the soul, unless there be also present there the various formulae of proportion and the various compositions in accordance with them. Each element will indeed know its fellow outside, but there will be no knowledge of bone or man unless they too are present in the constitution of the soul. The impossibility of this needs no pointing out, for who would suggest that stone or man could enter into the constitution of the soul? The same applies to the good and the not good, and so on. Further, the words has many meanings. It may be used of this or substance, or of a quantum, or of a quale, or of any other of the kinds of predicates we have distinguished. Does the soul consist of all of these or not? It does not appear that all have common elements. Is the soul formed out of those elements alone which enter into substances? So how will it be able to know each of the other kinds of thing? Will it be said that each kind of thing has elements or principles of its own, and that the soul is formed out of the whole of these? In that case, the soul must be a quantum and a quale and a substance. But all that can be made out of the elements of a quantum is a quantum, not a substance. These and others like them are the consequences of the view that the soul is composed of all the elements. It is absurd also to say both A, that like is not capable of being affected by like, and B, that like is perceived or known by like, for perceiving and also both thinking and knowing are, on their own assumption, ways of being affected or moved. There are many puzzles and difficulties raised by saying, as Empedocles does, that each set of things is known by means of its corporeal elements and by reference to something in soul which is like them, and additional testimony is furnished by this new consideration. For all the parts of the animal body which consists wholly of earth, such as bones, sinews, and hair, seem to be wholly insensitive and consequently not perceptive even of objects earthy like themselves, as they ought to have been. Further, each of the principles will have far more ignorance than knowledge, for though each of them will know one thing, there will be many of which it will be ignorant. Empedocles, at any rate, must conclude that his God is the least intelligent of all beings, for of him alone is it true that there is one thing, strife, which he does not know, while there is nothing which mortal beings do not know, for there is nothing which does not enter into their composition. In general, we may ask, why has not everything a soul, since everything either is an element, or is formed out of one or several or all of the elements? Each must certainly know one or several or all. The problem might also be raised, what is that which unifies the elements into a soul? The elements correspond, it would appear, to the matter. What unites them, whatever it is the supremely important factor. But it is impossible that there should be something superior to and dominant over the soul, and a fortiori over the mind. It is reasonable to hold that mind is by nature most primordial and dominant, while their statement that it is the elements which are first of all that is, all, both those who assert that the soul, because of its knowledge or perception of what is compounded out of the elements, and is those who assert that it is of all things the most originative of movement, fail to take into consideration all kinds of soul. In fact, 1. Not all beings that perceive can originate movement. There appear to be certain animals which stationary and yet local movement is the only one, so it seems, which the soul originates in animals. And 2. The same object unholds against all those who construct mind and the perceptive faculty out of the elements. For it appears that plants live and yet are not endowed with locomotion or perception, while a large number of animals are without discourse of reason. Even if these points were waived and mind admitted to be a part of the soul, and so too the perceptive faculty, still, even so, there would be kinds and parts of soul of which they had failed to give any account. The same objection lies against the view expressed in the Orphics poems. There it is said that the soul comes in from the whole when breathing takes place, being borne in upon the winds. Now this cannot take place in the case of plants, nor indeed in the case of certain classes of animal, for not all classes of animal breathe. This fact has escaped the notice of the holders of this view. If we must construct the soul out of the elements, there is no necessity to suppose that all the elements enter into its construction. One element in each pair of contraries will suffice to enable it to know both that element itself and its contrary. By means of the straight line, we know both itself and the curved. The carpenter's rule enables us to test both. But what is curved does not enable us to distinguish either itself or the straight. Certain thinkers say that soul is intermingled in the whole universe, and it is perhaps for that reason that Thales came to the opinion that all things are full of gods. This presents some difficulties. Why does the soul, when it resides in air or fire, not form an animal, while it does so when it resides in mixtures of the elements, and that although it is held to be of higher quality when contained in the former? One might add the question why the soul in air is maintained to be higher and more immortal than that in animals. Both possible ways of replying to the former question lead to absurdity or paradox, for it is beyond paradox to say that fire or air is an animal, and it is absurd to refuse the name of animal to what has soul in it. The opinion that the elements have soul in them seems to have arisen from the doctrine that a whole must be homogeneous with its parts. If it is true that animals become animate by drawing into themselves a portion of what surrounds them, the partisans of this view are bound to say that the soul of the whole too is homogeneous with all its parts. If the air sucked in is homogeneous but soul heterogeneous, clearly while some part of soul will exist in the in-breathed air, some other part will not. The soul must either be homogeneous, or such that there are some parts of the whole in which it is not to be found. From what has been said, it is now clear that knowing as an attribute of soul cannot be explained by a soul's being composed of the elements, and that it is neither sound nor true to speak of soul as moved. But since A. knowing, perceiving, opining, and further, B. desiring, wishing, and generally all other modes of appetition belong to soul, and the local movements of animals, and DIC, the local movements of animals, and D. growth, maturity, and decay are produced by the soul, we must. Soul as a whole, whether it is with the whole soul we think, perceive, move ourselves, act, or are acted upon, or whether each of them requires a different part of the soul, so too with regard to life. Does it depend on one of the parts of soul, or is it dependent on more than one, or on all, or has it some quite other cause? Some hold that the soul is divisible and that one part thinks, another desires. If, then, its nature admits of its being divided, what can it be that holds the parts together? Surely not the body. On the contrary, it seems rather to be the soul that holds the body together. At any rate, when the soul departs, the body disintegrates and decays. If, then, there is something else which makes the soul one, this unifying agency would have the best right to the name of soul, and we shall have to repeat for it the question, is it one or multipartite? If it is one, why not at once admit that the soul is one, if it has parts? Once more the question must be put, what holds its parts together, and so ad infinitum? The question might also be raised about the parts of the soul. What is the separate role of each in relation to the body? For if the whole soul holds together the whole body, we should expect each part of the soul to hold together a part of the body. But this seems an impossibility. It is difficult even to imagine what sort of bodily part mind will hold together or how it will do this. It is a fact of observation that plants and certain insects go on living when divided into segments. This means that each of the segments has a soul in it, identical in species, though not numerically identical in the different segments, for both of the segments for a time possess the power of sensation and local movement. That this does not last is not surprising, for they no longer possess the organs necessary for self-maintenance. But, all the same, in each of the bodily parts there are present all the parts of soul, and the souls so present are homogeneous with one another and with the whole. This means that the several parts of the soul are indisseverable from one another, although the whole soul is divisible. It seems also that the principle found in plants is also a kind of soul, for this is the only principle which is common to both animals and plants, and this exists in isolation from the principle of sensation, though there is nothing which has the latter without the former.